Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world at the moment. Thank you very much for joining Genius Methods for our series on our challenge series, where we're going to challenge some of the norms of today's expectations in the governance world. My name is Sharon Constanson, and I am the CEO of Genius Methods and of Genius Boards, and our specialism is board evaluations, board governance, board dynamics. We understand very much through our experience the behavior of what occurs within a boardroom environment and how to make that effective for all those present. So that is what we're going to be talking about today, is ultimately better boardroom dynamics. So how do we get there? We start with the nominations committee. That is our key beginning point. So I'm going to share some slides with you. Bear with me one moment and we shall proceed. Thanks very much for joining me. And we are now going to talk about board evaluations. What got everyone engaged in the first place was the poll that we started, which was to try and understand where is the marketplace on their views on where the board evaluation, on who should be on the nominations committee as the chair of that committee. And typically this has been the board director. If you look at the guidelines from ICSA, as in the Chartered Governance Institute, you will find that that is still very much the recommended best practice. And if you look at the code, it gives us that kind of guidance as well. But interesting enough, this group that responded to us, which was close on 200 individuals who responded to the poll, their views are aligned to what we are going to challenge the world with today. And it is not the chairman being the most applicable person in terms of being who should be chair to get the work done in an effective and efficient manner so that we don't have a poor cousin on the board. Now, as at last night, we were 44% in favor of an independent NED. As we stand right now, we are 43% each. They are both exactly the same, which is an interesting outcome. We'll discuss that near at the end as to what our views are, and we'll potentially get a look at what your views are when we get towards the end of our session. So thanks very much to all of those who are in attendance and those, of course, as well, who contributed to the poll. One of the contributors to the conversation on this subject, which was a really interesting one, is the fact that 83% of the FTSE 350 companies had the board chair as the NomCo chair. So as I said earlier, this is still the norm. It is very much new world best practice not to be in most of our views, but still there is the existing chairs, and it will take time for those to filter out through the system. And a comment made here by one of the participants in the conversation was, it's a thin line between the board chair being accountable for the board composition and driving their own agenda without a robust challenge from other non-executives. You can actually get the point that the chairman would like to own this one because it's the people that they're going to have to lead and be the chair of for the next 9 years or whatever's left of their tenure. So you can see the importance of the chairman being involved. So not being the chair of the committee does not mean not being involved. It means that somebody else is leading the logistics, the leadership, the process, the deliverables, the accountability, and keeping the energy of the activity moving through, which is importantly this whole issue around succession planning, which we are going to cover. And also bear in mind, you've got all the key committees of the board, and it is easier to make a change of an independent NED who is chair of a committee than to make a change to the chairman of the board who is a committee chairman, because of the deference to authority and the complexity around ego and expectations. It makes it just that bit more complex and difficult to make those changes. So sometimes you're going to leave yourself with some flexibility as well. But I'm going to cover in this presentation a lot more of the important reasons as to why we should be considering this changed point of view. The other thing we need to also consider is that the board chair is the individual tasked with the board governance responsibility of the board, in supported 100% by the company secretary and the rest of the board. It is a joint responsibility. but your lead governance responsibility actually comes from the chairman's responsibility. So it is important to take that into mind, into consideration at all times. Right. One of the key things that impacts the board that we want to address is the late succession planning that occurs as a result of the NomCo nominations committee not being fully effective. What is things that we need to take into account is what is common practice isn't necessarily any more best practice. Do think about it, a lot of things have changed in our agendas on the board. If you look at what we were talking about 5 years ago and what we're talking about now, our code is already 3 years old. And the change has brought in what I call the modern agenda, which is the green agenda, climate change, and those other issues that are so critically important for companies to now be focusing on. So the things that we want to be aware of as to where the challenge comes to an effective nominations committee existing is undue influence. Who is influencing what is the outcome? So the challenged and honourable position somebody might have is to be on that selection committee. If their mate's on that selection committee, they might have undue influence. So we've got to be very aware that this is a key place of bias and influence. So bias against any aspect of diversity and influence over somebody you know or don't know, like or don't like, or any of the other ways you might be judging an individual. You might want somebody who is a banker and somebody else wants somebody who is a retail customer expert, and it's the same board we're talking about. So the issue that is important is to keep the nominations committee active, proactively looking at all the issues. Now, later we're going to look at what a succession plan might look like. And this is planning 9 years out, reviewed annually. And that is the importance that we need to consider. We're really dealing with, probably really dealing with the person's ego. So asking a chair who is used to considering themselves being the nominations committee chairman now are being found that that is not part of their role, and they feel like something has been taken away, they're not as important. But yet when you think about it, the role of chair is so huge and it's so big. To be done properly, you don't actually want the chairman to be dividing their tasks and responsibilities in terms of leading something else. But we do want the chairman to be 100% involved and committed to and engaged with the whole headhunting process and ensuring the spec is aligned to what they want to see on their committee. So we do want their involvement. That is absolutely critical. But what we've got to do is we've got to manage bias. Now, whether this is the company secretary managing that, whether it's the HR person managing it, whether it's the headhunter managing it, or whether it is the individuals who are leading the project, the chair of that committee, making sure that bias is not creeping in any way. And the HR people will give us a lot of tips on how to negate bias stepping in, because we're human. We're not, metacognitive bias does not exist. It means, yes, we do have bias. We know we have bias. We just got to manage it. Another aspect is money. Money is always the thing that drives people, and it's prestige, it's pride, it's ego, it's positioning. Those are all the things that are very critical to us as individuals as we work our way through the corporate ladder. The other aspect that we've got is the two lead people within an organization are naturally and correctly immersed to a degree in their own importance. Whether that is the CEO leading the organization, or whether that is the board chairman who is leading the board of the organization. So people who have no self-importance, no self-drive, pride and desire for succeeding will not have got to these roles. So they are there because they're capable, competent, have the drive, and have the power and ambition to achieve it. So we will get self-importance. That's absolutely true. But what we've got is a ticking clock. Now, lots of people know about ticking clocks. You've got to be on a webinar at a certain amount of time. You've got to catch a train. You've got to wake up in the morning. We always have this clock ticking in every aspect of our lives. But in this aspect, you've got 9 years max to make a difference. And every day is one day less of your tenure of the importance of being a board chairman. And it's accepting and addressing that passage of time and being very open about transitioning off a board. For example, I am a chairman of the board, and I'm talking to my own board 2 years ahead, saying the governance committee, in our case, which had this nominations, needs to pick up on my replacement, and they need to start now. I can't do it. I'm not allowed to do it. I can't even be involved, but it has to be done and be taken care of. And to start 2 years before a chairman renewal or replacement is not unreasonable. It takes time to decide what you want, have a look at candidates, see if you've got internal, appoint some potential internal people as well, and look at refreshing the board in that run-up process. So it needs to be done in time, and it does take months. Plan on at least 6 months once you get to that final stage, after all the planning and after all the getting ready, having the facts right, and knowing what kind of chairman you want. And that will change in the life of the organization as you evolve through the growth of the company, maturity of the company, profitability of the company, the next major challenge of the company. You're going to want a different kind of chairman in each of those positions. There's the fear of not being wanted, feeling that they are past their sell-by date, that they're not bringing value anymore. So that personal self-doubt that naturally embeds itself in any of us when we no longer have a role or a position that we felt was giving us pride of place. So there's that sort of personal, emotional feeling that we all need to address and understand and to support. And then you've got the requirements to perform and the challenge that brings, and also the highs that brings to individuals when they do perform, they do succeed. It's absolutely critical. But the problem that you've got is that with all of these things being done as chair of the board, we do not have focus on the committee. The committee will lose all these things that will start to happen as administrative tasks delegated to HR and to the company secretary, respectively, as appropriate, depending on the organization. But it won't be focusing correctly for the benefit of the organization's boardroom dynamics. So really what we're looking at is about control. The chairman wants to have control of who is on their board, and they can have an input, they cannot have influence, and they cannot have control. So it's delegating and removing the potential risk of bias and cronyism and family and people that are going to vote your way. So it is so critically important to get this aspect right. The other aspect is how much they want the control, and that is seen as being an administrative behavior. We are looking at the fact that it's the detail, it's the fundamental doing stuff that really is where the problem really truly arises. If you're in a situation where the chairman is now going to have to do the detail, he's going to have to write the spec, he's got to read it, he's got to edit it, he's got to talk to headhunters, he's got to sort the diary out, he's got to be in certain places. So you get the tedious. This actually is not fun. This is not enjoyable. This is just process. This is the day job. I'm not really interested in that part. So you get the procrastination and the abdication of getting started on many of these projects, being the risk, because you know once you get into it, there is a lot of administration involved. And that is why you have the correct team within the nominations committee, so that even the nominations chair is not directly involved in that detail of doing, but they lead it, they plan it, their project management, they're accountable, they ensure the individuals on the committee are accountable to the project plan as set out. So this is the way that we negate getting delays, because the committee chairman is now accountable to the board. It's very difficult to hold your own board chairman to account when they're not delivering on the succession plan. So this way you've got a much stronger and more robust governance structure and accountability within the board environment. Looking a little bit further, we look at committee chairmanship norms. We have a committee supported by the company secretary, direct report in most cases, And you have your typical, always seen audit, remuneration and nominations committees. The smaller the organization, the more some of these things might be combined in certain ways. The larger the organization, the more we might want to add. So we do see a complete mixture of that kind of committee structures that we see within organizations. So if we go on one step and we say, what might we see in a FTSE company, for example? You might see a risk committee in addition. You might see in financial services a culture committee. You might see in a investment trust an investment committee. You might see, for example, in a company that is going through a major IT project or culture project, you might have a transformation committee. There are many other committees that might be there permanently or there for a period of time, not there for the whole duration. So if we look at this example, because risk is probably the most typical fourth committee, we have, in terms of the code, an accountant who is responsible for chairing the audit committee, and they need to have had a certain degree of experience on an audit committee beforehand. Remuneration, have to have been on a remuneration committee before and need to have an aspect of remuneration delivery experience. The risk side, the expectation is that you've got somebody who has delivered on a risk agenda in some nature before, not as defined as audit, obviously remuneration is even less defined. Audit is the most regulatory one, remuneration one down, risk one down, and then we seem to forget about nominations. We don't seem to think that that is so critically important. So if we look at the typical chairman of the board seems to sit in this position. So now what I want to just share with you is my challenge, that why is the nominations committee not treated as an equal committee? Why is it not given the airtime it deserves as a committee that needs to look after its remit and therefore the stakeholders that are involved as the outcome of the committee's work? So therefore my view is we should not have the chairman of the board as the chair of the committee. I've given you a couple of good governance reasons why as well. The load needs to be spread by each of the committees, and they deserve to have an engaged and focused chair that is running that committee, that is competent and experienced in the remit of the committee. And the remits are typically nominations, and with that goes succession planning, risk matrix, boardroom dynamics, board evaluation, board governance, and to a certain degree, sometimes we have other aspects of governance. So now we have a look at this map again, and we say, well, what could we put in there? So we need a person who is very people orientated. We need somebody who is high on EQ, who can assess people and not be biased by the persona and the presentation, but to understand the person underneath, and to have a good respect for governance and an understanding of the value of governance. And equally, when I talk about people, we're talking about the whole HR process, HR engagement, motivation of people, how do we define the specifications for the job? All that range becomes very critically important. So to carry that challenge through, however this is the industry norm, again, we talk about it as being the challenge coming from Genius, that we want to see this changed. The individuals being appointed to the board in the succession process, those that are changing roles in the executive as a result of succession, and those that are members on the committee, all deserve to have the right capabilities within a greater committee to deliver good work. That is your right as a stakeholder to that committee. That committee and those people, those stakeholders deserve the time and focus to be able to engage and have a positive outcome. They also require the proactivity, like you get an audit, there's a process, the proactivity, remuneration is a process, but that doesn't seem to have followed through to nominations yet. And sometimes nominations committees are brought and formed for the purpose of one appointment, and that usually takes a couple of days the way they do it, and they just go through the formal minuting process of the nominations committee. That, I mean, and I've seen that occur in a FTSE 250 company even. What we should be seeing is a permanent committee that meets a minimum of at least 4 times a year and during a appointment or succession process is putting in additional calls and meetings in between to ensure that the work is done as you would on a RemCo when you're reviewing a RemCo policy. It is important that that time is provided and these plans get going well in advance. What we also need is to widen our scope as a nominations committee. There's an argument going around consistently that headhunters look at too narrow a playing field when they're looking for non-executive directors. There's the constant belief that the financial services sector is pushing for diversity, whether it be ethnicity or whether it be gender or age or digital capability. They are pushing for it, but yet they're getting the same people and they're not getting new blood into that circle on the boardroom chairs of all those organizations in the city. So it is important to ensure you get the right headhunter who is then going to take on the wider remit and broader remit that you give them and deliver on it. So it starts now actually with the nominations committee. They're the ones who've got to define the wider scope. Don't end up being fooled into a sales pitch by a headhunting environment who might be pitching it in a certain way to get the role rather than actually doing what's right by the organization. So once again, bias, outcome, purpose, what are you there to do? And make sure you own it and lead it as a nomination committee. While you're in the process of looking for that chair role right at the beginning, is to ensure we have that decent dose of EQ, communication skills, social skills, being able to debate and put forward their ideas, to argue a point of view, to be able to judge people, understand people in an effective manner. Those are all absolutely critical. The number of times I've seen a very polished presenter present to a board committee for application to the job, getting it because they're slicker than all of them, and that was a complete facade. That was all they were good at. They're actually not good at doing the day job. The due diligence on individuals just absolutely has to be done properly. And that's the work of the committee. You cannot rely 100% on the headhunters to do that work. Very often today, they're using psychometric tests to support that human-to-human assessment, because so many people are biased and get the human assessment wrong. The other thing that we need to look at is some of the sort of supporting forces around us. One of them is from the FRC Financial Reporting Council, where they have defined in provision 17 that the board should establish a nomination committee to lead the process of appointments. Ensure plans in place for orderly succession in both the board and in senior management. We'll look at some statistics in a moment on that. And oversee the development of a diverse pipeline for succession into the succession pipeline. They also say the majority of the members should be independent non-executive directors. It's typically 3, and they're typically 3 independent directors. But you can, based on this, have 2 independent and 1 non-independent, which means there is space, even within your restriction of 3, to have the chairman as one of the members of the committee. And they very clearly state that the chair should not chair the succession of their own role. So, but that applies whether it's a SID role and the SID is involved. Whoever is being appointed, that person cannot get involved. So here we're looking at the issue of appointments, which we've talked about. We're talking about an orderly process, planned well in advance, well structured, well thought through for both the board and the executive, the senior management team, or whatever the equivalent wording is. It ensures that we are addressing diversity, not to tick a box, but to do the right thing by the organization and to bring in that alternative, different thinking. I have an analogy where I talk about diversity. You either have 12 puppies of a litter, which we wouldn't call diverse, and we risk groupthink. We then have a menagerie of animals, and you have got parrots, you've got snakes, you've got dogs, you've got wild animals, you've got rabbits, you've got mice, you've got you name it, all in this mix with no commonality whatsoever amongst those individuals. That alignment process then becomes almost an impossible chairing job for the chair to actually get people to come to effective and logical decision making within a respectable amount of time. So what you're looking for example, would be a pack of dogs that are all different dogs, but they're dogs. So therefore, we're getting that commonality, that alignment to purpose of the organization, which is critically important. We've covered the other 2 points already. KPMG in combination, one of the headhunting firms, actually put out a report on the nomination committee and some very interesting stats around diversity, how people get the role, do they come from inside, are they external recruits, number of points. And it's interesting, the chair, whether it be a woman or a man, typically the appointments are more often from outside, but there are times where there's an influence that if it's a female, the chances are that is an internal appointment more likely than it is external. So it's interesting, even at this level where you've got this broadest knowledge of the impact of diversity, we are still behaving and responding to the triggers of the differences that we should not be doing. We should be treating them all as equal. We talk here about the nominations committee being considered the poor relation of the traditional main board. We've covered that in quite a bit of detail. And the reason being, it doesn't get the regulatory attention that the audit committee gets, and it doesn't get the media attention that you get from a remuneration committee, which can be splashed all over the press because somebody's earning a good salary, or there's great gender gap, or there's a societal level gap between the chairman and or CEO and within the organization. So it is very important for us to consider the role of this nominations committee and to give it its empowered status, which is important that the chair of that committee ensures that that committee has the full and equal rights as a board committee as any of the other committees that exist. The new chair will have to bring a transition and a change of focus and to address all the many responsibilities, which we'll address in a moment, that fall within the remit of the nominations committee. One of them is clearly boardroom dynamics. If we get a spanner into the works of our board, you are going to have disruption. You want somebody to ask the difficult questions now and then, absolutely we do, but we don't want somebody to be downright difficult and actually undermine what's happening in the board on a consistent basis. And what's bringing this change now is that investors are actually taking the trouble to focus on the source of the problem. They're looking for diversity, they're looking for good boardroom dynamics, they're looking for good leadership of the organization. They don't want them to be making the wrong decisions. You want them to be challenging the executive and stretching them. And all these things start with the right people being on the board, which means we come back again to the nominations committee. And investors are now focusing on that. And we've seen a number of occasions where activist investors have actually removed the chairman and put their own chairman in, or have allowed the process, which they should do, of going through a robust external recruitment process to appoint the chairman. And they may well, as activists or as investors, put forward that, but they should go through the full process that the others do as well. So this focus is actually a good transition that we're seeing, where the investors now are not only looking at the bottom line, the person that delivers the bottom line, they're actually looking at how does the board work as a unit, and that is becoming far more important today, which will deliver all the other outcomes that are desired. If you look at the composition of the board in the FTSE 100, it does vary quite dramatically. And the issue that I always have a problem with, and it's good to see it now in writing, which is the first time I have actually seen it in writing, is that too many boards take the lazy route out. And this is a lazy chairman because he is the chairman of the nominations committee, just to tag this conversation on to the end of a board meeting. So, all right, all of you, you can all be on the nominations committee, and let's just have this conversation quickly and follow, let's get the process moving. So you end up with too many people involved in it. And if they all want to play an active role, which you want directors to do if they're on the committee, you're going to get nothing done in a hurry. So you don't want more than 3 people involved in the recruitment process or in focusing on any of the issues of the committee, as you would do in any other committee, because otherwise that noise at a challenge level is too much. The outcomes is you don't get any leadership focus when everyone is there because we just tagged it onto the board meeting, or the meetings are not robust and are not held in a safe place to have the conversation, because you've got a turkey in the room and he doesn't want Christmas to come earlier. So those kind of things negate the ability for the board to be effective. The result is we make limited decisions, no decisions, or we take so much time over the decisions and we are not looking at the skills. That's what we should be looking at, the skills of what we're going to bring onto the board. So in all cases, committees tend to create a smaller subset that will engage with the headhunters, engage with the company secretary, engage with HR, and be brought into the process in an ad hoc basis as needed through the timeline of activities. So typically in defining the spec, typically then to meet the chosen headhunter, and or maybe even be involved in choosing the headhunter, and then when it gets to the shortlist. So they tag in even those three as needed in that timeline. They're not permanently involved. I think EY had some points for boards and nominations committees to consider, which are extremely valid. And also first time I've seen some of these aspects in a written format. Is making sure that you actually have your terms of reference appropriate. If you look at some of the older style terms of reference frameworks that I came across, a lot of organizations have improved on those frameworks now. And the process of how they look for talent, do they do it on LinkedIn or do they do it in some more robust manner? And here is another occasion where I've seen the note that it maybe is not appropriate for the chair to be involved in the heavy lifting part of this work. So looking at the future composition, looking at the future boardroom dynamics, we'd expect the chair of the board to be involved and to guide the nominations committee as to what their expectations, demands, desires are of the new board directors. So however much they don't have the deciding factor, they have a very influential, hopefully mostly positively, if not negated by the other chair, input into some of the things they think would be good to include in the remit for that non-executive director. So they will be looking at diversity, which is what we've talked about earlier. They will be looking at how they fit into the succession planning mix. Do we get in the future chair 4 years before, for example, and put them through some of the committee chair roles first, try them out, give them the experience, get them to know the business, or we're going to do it right at the end. So you've got various routes of doing it. The other thing that the committee must consider is the makeup of skills within the board. Yeah, what do we have? What are we missing? What will we lose when the next person retires off the board? What happens if somebody is taken off the board for whatever reason? What might we lose? What in our risk antennae perspective is a risk load of somebody leaving and losing those skill sets? And also the importance for this committee to engage with the headhunting fraternity through the company secretary and others to make sure that it is very efficiently handled. We talked about some stats a little earlier, and the board succession planning indicates that only this year, 1.1% in 2020's financials was the issue around succession planning dealt with in detail. 1.14% of, and I think this is the FTSE 350, there you go. So it's a large number of companies, only 1.1%. Good, we're only looking at 21%. Half of them are sitting in general, and we've got the other bits and pieces sitting on none, very low, fortunately, and basic. So you've almost got a perfect bell curve as a result of that statistic. You couldn't probably have got it more accurate than our voting that has been done as well. The other one that they've given us the statistics on is the ratio of planning for the senior management regime, and how do they describe the senior management succession planning process. And here we have detailed, none at all. And then on the none at all, we have quite high ratios of 18 and 12% over the recent years. So in last year, we had 12% of the organizations did not talk about the senior management succession plan at all. So a major remit in terms of our code of corporate governance, they have not done it at all. Then you've got basic, which is the majority, 35% last year. And then we look at a very general level, 34%. So we're only looking at 17% of the FTSE 350 have considered senior management regime, senior management succession in an effective manner. Now, the problem you always have with an annual report, and I should not be saying what I'm about to say, is sometimes it's the shop window, it's not actually what's in the storeroom behind. So I worked with a company once, and their risk report was absolutely incredible. It was one of the best risk reports I had ever read. Very, very well put together. But actually, once I did the board evaluations, I found out that they didn't even address risk. They didn't even have a risk committee. They were in a high risk environment, but they didn't actually do risk at all as a board. And interesting enough, when challenged, the chair said, no, it's a global board responsibility. I'm not delegating that to a committee. Yet we all know the committee is there to do the deep dives to ensure that it is owned by the board at a strategic level rather than not doing anything at all, which is what turns out to be the case quite often. So it's important that we focus on the right things and delegate it to people who have better insights and knowledge to be able to look at these things in detail. So the point of the plan I'm going to show you in a moment is it's always a 9-year rolling plan. So we're thinking out 9 years. I can guarantee you what you write down now will not be what's going to happen over the next 9 years, but at least you're planning and you have got an evolving situation. So each year you're going to be updating that succession plan to deal with changes of resignations, needing to step off because of high work commitments, changes in the organization, new committees, change committees. So we have all the different business reasons of why people come off a board and don't do their full 9 years. They might even be voted off the board. That also does happen from time to time. One of the things we do know is that chairmen seem on average to succeed longer in their role than the average CEO of a FTSE 350. And it's the chairman is closer towards the 6+ years, and the CEO is around 4 and lower, in some sectors as low as 2 years only. So to get this to work and to get it owned and to get it moving is you do need often some kind of external support and help to bring this to the importance of the board. And a board evaluation or a governance review or a review by a headhunter, a review by an HR consultant are all ways in which you can actually bring this to the fore and actually make sure that it is dealt with and owned by the committee effectively and part of the board agenda. So it can be done sort of as an independent exercise of succession planning, or can be part of a bigger exercise within the annual plan. And it's one of the things we do find as a board evaluator is addressing this head on does literally give the nominations committee wings. Actually it sets them free and allows them to make such a difference to the board composition in a very, very short period of time. We are asked by the Corporate Governance Code to regularly refresh the board. So 9 years is not what you have to do. Now, the nominations committee should say it's 3 and we'll consider further. Some of them actually will say, no, it's 6. At 6, it comes to an end and they refresh it a lot faster. So it's working out when you've got a really good person, you want them to stay the 9. But they do go native and they do not look as critically at issues. They take a lot of things that are, this is the way we do things here, and they start to take things for granted. Now, I know this is very small, and that depending on whether you're on a phone or whether you are on a big 32-inch screen sitting in front of you, to be able to read it. So it's something I'm very happy to share. The slides will be available, so you can have a look at something like this. So here we are looking at the situation of only 2 independent non-execs are on the board. We've got 6 of them currently. They were all appointed at the same time, and they're going to roll off now. How are we going to roll them off so that we don't end up with all 6 going at 6 years or all 6 going at 9 years? So putting in a plan in this particular example to roll company individuals off at a faster rate. We also are looking at bringing in additional people onto the board, the 6 not being sufficient for the board committees and the responsibilities of the organization. We recommended them increasing the board size. So in this case, they're looking at the different competencies and skills they had, looking at who was currently chairs of the respective committees. We looked at, therefore, a new audit chair with the right requirements and a new risk chair with the right requirements, and brought them on immediately, ballooning the board from the current 6 to 8. That then allows for an increase in our independence from 2 directors to 4 directors. Immediately, if you compare that against our original 6, we're starting now with almost 2/3 of the original number, which gives us a far better position to work from. Even though technically we are only at 50%, so we haven't passed the governance benchmark, which is more than 50% need to be considered as independent. And please bear in mind, our chairman of the main board is not considered as an independent independent director. So then we went through the process of replacing the directors after a period of another 2 years. The roll-off starts on the top side, the new directors coming in on the bottom side. And so we're looking at the bold figures, which give their retirement periods to be considered or re-election periods to be considered. And so we count out the independents and we count out the requirement for constant renewal. So if you have a look in up for review, in this current year, this board needed to deal with 6 re-elections. The following year, none, but then we go to 7 of them. No, sorry, they've got 6 at the moment, and in their planning, they need to have a look at, we are at 4, we're planning for getting to 6. And at that point, they've got all 7 that they need to consider, because the first 2 that have come on have now got to year 3, and we've lost somebody. So we've got 7 we need to consider. So you can see the rolling totals that have to be then taken into account. So this committee can plan its work, looking ahead and looking then at the skills matrix as to who's rolling off and therefore what they need to consider, as well as looking at the gaps that already might exist. So we've looked at tenure, we've looked at roles, we've looked at independence, we've looked at appointment, we've looked at retirement, re-election, and so one piece of paper has given us insight at all levels of our succession plan of the board. Now, this can be done for the senior management team, but there you might not be looking at replacement external directors. You'll be looking at people within the organization that could step up if required. Now, quite often a succession plan says that the CFO will take over from the CEO if something happens. And working with an organization a couple of years ago, this is what did occur, and the individual stepped up into the shoes of the CEO role. But given that person's background, they were not of a character in their DNA to actually have been a CEO. Ego wanted it. Because he'd been there long enough, people felt that was appropriate, that the organization had its blood in him, and he was very much part of the institution. So therefore, it was a natural consideration to make him a CEO. Nobody once decided whether he'd make a good CEO. Would he be able to handle the people? Would he be able to step up out of the senior team and be a leader of these people? Did he have the personality to be able to call the entire business to account? Did he know how to run a company? And the answer to all of those things was no. But yet they had made that mistake so genuinely by not thinking through the things that we make sure organizations do think through. If you're looking at succession plan on the committees, for example, here we've got a very broad remit of changes. We've got the new directors coming on in pink at the bottom that we talked about a moment ago. The green ones, we've taken the chairman off the board chair role, and we've retained and also taken the board chairman off the board governance as a member, stating that they shouldn't be a member of any committee, but should be invited to any committee that they have something to contribute to. And that's not them creating the invitation, it's the chair of the committee creating the invitation. There's a moot point as to whether the chair should be a member of things like risk or of nominations or of remuneration. And a lot there will depend on board chairman's competencies and capabilities and value add. I prefer that they don't, even if they have that, but rather to act as an independent sounding board to the existing chair of the committee, so that together they can work these things out in a logical way, that the chair or the committee is not left on their own. So there we've got a map of how we have transitioned change on the nominations committee and how we've transitioned change on the board governance committee, and ensured we've got a balance of a number of roles between all the individual the board directors, ensuring and looking at this. The first thing one would do, if you're sitting in my role as a board evaluator, I would very much go and have a look at Miss Wellbeing and quickly determine whether that person is feeling emotionally victimized by not having the same 3 roles that everyone else has got. So that's the sort of thing that we look at when we're doing the board evaluation, to understand that. You've got the SID, who's effectively got 2 roles. Yes, they've got the SID role and 2 roles. They've got a lot of experience on the board, so they can work effectively. We take the chairman back down to just the chair role. So as a nominations committee, you are responsible for the 2 most important people in the organization, and as well their teams, to ensure that this organization is successful, focused on its purpose and delivering its strategy. So other areas that the committee needs to consider, which we talked about a moment ago, is succession, the skills matrix, determining one. The funniest thing you see is when you ask a board of directors to fill in the skills matrix themselves, it's amazing how suddenly competent they've become, and you never knew that because you've never seen it demonstrated. It's quite incredible how they are good at everything and nothing's missing. So invariably you have to do this as an external exercise. Job specifications, identifying boardroom dynamics and to see what needs to be done. Governance, HR, executive succession, diversity, IQ, knowledge. The other aspect is capacity, watching for capacity, watching for well-being, determining if board directors are resilient, whether they're agile, or whether there's support needed of all the individuals who are in the boardroom environment. Because not only do executives need to have their well-being considered, so do directors. The committee is not an island and needs to work within the entire board, needs to work with the chair, needs to work with the other chairs of committees, what their needs are. So it is a working together operation, bringing in executives to support it, as well as bringing in other, I use the word associates. They're not members of the committee, but they're people you turn to work with. We've covered a lot of material. I would like now to just have a summary, which is the NomCo is critical to create an effective board that has appropriate culture and boardroom dynamics. I feel very strongly that this is really, really important. And if you get there, it's like winning the chess game. You've actually got there the wonderful feeling of success when you can actually reach that place is really, really critical. Before I cover the last point, I'd just like to determine whether we have got any questions in the note. We haven't, and we one person's had to drop off. Anybody else like to drop a question in the chat? We've got 10 minutes, and I'd love to see if we can solve certain challenges that any of you might have as individuals. You can place it in Q&A, or you could place it in the chat box. I can watch both of them. While people are typing, I would like to just address the couple of the typical things we might see happening so that people have got a few moments. One of the critical things is, how do you empower the nominations committee chair when the board chairman has just stepped out of the role and this person's now come in? Now, a lot of that will depend on whether that individual was on the board before or was appointed for the purpose, and how the chemistry works between the 2 individuals, and do they hit it off with a natural respect for one another at the beginning, or is there this sort of challenge feeling and testosterone and territory has come out at the first level. And that does not mean it's male or male. It can be male or female. I can promise you there's plenty of testosterone around in those individuals as well. So we are all very territorial. We all are at risk of wanting to protect that space we're in. So one of the key areas, ways in which we can empower is for the chairman to actually genuinely hand over and step away and act as a genuine coach, mentor, and sounding board at a completely genuine level, because it's in that person's interest as chair, because it's their board that is going to be the outcome. And they definitely need to make sure that they have committed in the right way and act as the right sounding board and not deliver any undue influence. It all sounds so easy. And yes, it's so easy for it to go wrong. We see that regularly going wrong. So another one I'd like to just have a look at from one of the questions that I see is, what happens if it's the chair of the board that needs to be changed? And how does the nominations committee own that space while the chairman is in situ and in role at that point in time? It is a very complex one, and probably one of the most difficult jobs the nominations committee needs to take on, because invariably you have to do it while the chairman is continuing to chair the board. It can be done as a secretive affair. It could be done in an open governance way. That is the decision that the board needs to take, and will depend on all the different circumstances and the likelihood that individual is going to be aware of it or engage with it, and how they might react. It all needs to be handled. This is where the degree of EQ of nominations committee and the company secretary come to the fore. We're having to approach the chairman and advise them that their role is going to be reconsidered. Some of them will just leave immediately and say, it's fine, I'm going, because they can't handle that transition period. Others will warm to it and will willingly coach and mentor the incoming person. And you've got that complete range of input and decisions. Another question we've got is, what are typical pushbacks that occur to the work of the nominations committee? And probably the most typical pushback is, it's seen as a cost. This whole process is seen as a cost, and that will typically come from the finance arm of the organization or any financial people on the board. And it's interesting, you will see a finance person not spend 3,000 to take an existing program and enhance it by 3,000 to do an additional piece of work, but rather save that 3,000, not do the piece of work, the whole thing collapses and it costs hundreds or millions instead. But that is not their decision, and they are not accountable for it, but they are accountable for the 3,000 of going over budget at the current point in time. So once again, it's looking at, why are you getting the pushback, from whose agenda, and what influence is that agenda having on what is right for the business? It is very difficult to determine what is right for the business in every aspect. Extremely challenging. Last question I want to just cover is, we've been asked to what degree, or who, actually, let me just reread it. Who is the person that will be most competent at affecting change within the committee environment of the nominations committee? And I have to say, in my view, based on the personalities that we typically see in the roles, and I am averaging and making many assumptions, is a combination of the company secretary with the chairman of the nominations committee together. One person on the inside, one person on the outside. Both of them are either director of the board or accountable directly to the chairman. It brings the chairman into the equation. It brings the whole board into the equation. And if I was sensible in that space, I would definitely engage in the CEO as well. is no point bringing on the best director possible that you can find. And the CEO says, well, you didn't include me, so I won't include that. And you do get that mindlessness and type of behavior occurring. That covers most of the themes of the questions that we've been given. I'd like to thank you. It's been a bit of a monologue in one direction. Please download the slide deck, share it with your colleagues, share it with your nominations committee, and we look forward to you joining us on our next challenge series, which will be in a month's time. What we will be doing is putting 3 short teaser assessments onto our website alongside the video, where you can assess the 3 aspects. We are doing an assessment of the nominations committee itself. It's only a very, very short questionnaire. We're not charging anybody who's been on this event for those accessing these webinars. They are only valid until the end of the year. They'll expire at that point. The other one will be an assessment of the skills assessment maturity process in the organization. How capable are we of determining what the skill sets genuinely are within the organization? So how well are we achieving that skills matrix outcome? And the third one will be the succession plan. So addressing the succession plan and to what degree your succession plan is fit for purpose for your business, and determining on a ratio what kind of improvements you can make to your succession plan. And anybody who would like at this point in time to just brainstorm with us and have a look at the kind of succession plan matrix we use, I'm happy to discuss it with you. If you want me to share it with you, I think you're going to have to employ us to help you. And I had a couple of thank yous that have been coming through. Thanks very much for those. It's very rewarding when you've been talking to yourself for an hour, and to understand that we've still got a good room of people behind us and are listening and are engaging with the exercise. We will send you the URL links to these 3 assessments later in the week with the live recording of the day's events, so that you've got both the slide deck as well as this recording, so that you can share it internally. And actually, the objective we're giving of these challenges going forward is, what is the right thing to do? It might be different to the norm, but is it going to make your board a better place? Are the directors going to leave from every board meeting and say, I added value, rather than wanting to kill somebody out of sheer frustration that the board meeting hadn't worked the way it should, and they don't feel like they have brought their intelligence and value and they've delivered value as board directors, which is so important. On the hour, I'd like to thank you all for attending and for staying right until this point. I really do appreciate it. And our dates for the next event will be up shortly, which will be in about a month's time. Thank you very much to everybody, and appreciate what you have done, what time you have put aside to share with Genius today. Thank you.